Rainworld is a strange game. It is different in many ways from its figurative siblings in the vast family of 2D platformers, and this sort of unconventionality affords it a lot of unique weaknesses and a lot of unique strengths. It is a game that is deeply appreciated by some of the people who have actually managed to play through it, but it also has certain kinks of game design that have turned others away before they could fully experience it, which might have created an incomplete image of what rainworld really is in the eyes of critics and general audiences both. The reception of the game has been influenced by its unintuitive nature and punishing difficulty, things that make the first few hours of it, and some subsequent parts, nothing short of a grueling and even irritating experience. Several bad elements compound on the player as they come into the game as a first-timer, and that can feel simultaneously overwhelming and disempowering. Most of the opinions that I've encountered, whether they speak positively or negatively about the game, warn about quality of life and clarity issues, or tell personal tales of being repeatedly killed by lizards, becoming stuck, and having to take a break out of frustration, or just dropping the game altogether as a result. I'm no stranger to these feelings either. After being stuck in some of the earlier areas for some time, I had to take a break from the game because of the helplessness that I was experiencing, in terms of controls, in terms of directions, and in terms of progress. I just wasn't having a lot of fun and had yet to see an incentive or kernel of something that would inspire me to keep going. I was even considering refunding the game, something I've never done before, on the basis that it wasn't the kind of product I was expecting. I was anticipating a regular, straightforward 2D platformer, or perhaps a Metroidvania, where I can just load the game up, mentally clock out and have myself a fun evening, but what I got instead was something far more undefined, unwieldy, unexpectedly stimulating, and just generally weird. However, once I've thought about it for a good long while and begrudgingly gave the game another shot, I ended up being very glad to have done so. I played through the entire story in pretty much one go. In a total 180, it turned out to be one of the best games that I've ever played, and this is no exaggeration. The gameplay itself got more satisfactory as I got used to the controls and became more skilled in the techniques of survival and the utilization of the environment, and by the time I got to the end of the first third of the story, I was completely captivated. The game affected me on a level I honestly wasn't expecting, and it made me think and feel a lot of different things. This process was helped along by the astonishing visuals and the otherworldly sounds and music, both of which do a fantastic job of accentuating the concepts and ideas found in Rainworld, such as the inventive brutality of nature, the despair of exposure, the melancholy of loneliness, and the quiet sorrow of an extinct world, just to name a few. Even simple ideas like juxtaposing the small, humble slugcat with a cruel, imposing world of immense scale get elevated to a level of refinement through the immaculate presentation. So, the game is great, that much was clear to me. It put me through certain trials and tribulations, but in the end I can say that it was worth it. So the rightful question comes, why do these new player issues even exist? Why is Rainworld so inhospitable at the beginning? Why would you choose to hide such a gem under such a troublesome exterior? It certainly isn't a mistake on the part of Video Cult, it's merely a byproduct of the way the game is built, and this consciously unique design has its own advantages as well as kinks. For an unacquainted player, the game is definitely a little hostile and confusing, but this leads to payoffs and events later on that otherwise couldn't have been achieved. So, let us examine the elements that contribute to the strangeness and infamy of Rainworld right at the start. In a time when most games have an extensive tutorial and are filled with many different widgets and menus that are sometimes complicated to the point where those widgets and menus get their own tutorials, Rainworld seems unusually and almost uncomfortably bare. The game gives you a very basic idea of the movement system and explains the functionality of food and shelters, and that's it. After that, you are on your own. The ability to interpret and understand things without being told in a particular way is like a muscle. It can only be improved and strengthened if it gets frequent practice. I have no doubt that for a lot of people, me included, who usually play games where the discovery portion of the game consists of reading through several pages of instructions and descriptions, rainworld was initially obtuse and even frustrating with the tiny amount of information it willingly surrenders. Am I going the right way? Should I be doing this? What does this weird thing want? None of these questions are given a clear answer right out of the gate. Things aren't put on a pedestal, a lot of new elements of the world are introduced in an absolutely indifferent manner, to the point where you, as the player, have to make the effort to spot new things and get into a more investigative mindset than you usually would. As you go along, once you do enough of this, you will start to feel more home in the world, and you will tackle the new, unexplored areas featuring yet unknown creatures and mechanics with that much more success. Survival will come more easily to you. To cite a concrete example of this from my playthrough, and also because I think it's a vital piece of information in general, I had no idea what popcorn plants were until the overseer pointed me towards one. I wasn't even aware that I could interact with them at all. I was under the impression that they were just more elaborate background sprites at first. As it turns out, they are very useful plants, and they can massively help you out in tight spots when you run out of bat flies and blue fruit. After this experience, for every new thing that caught my eye, I had to test it. I had to see for myself how I could interact with something, what it would do in response, and how could I use that to my advantage, which led to some great moments and findings. Not just because of the joy of discovery itself, but also the feeling of ingenuity upon correctly using or defeating something just based on assumption and wits, and gaining new understanding. In accordance with its fulfillment of the fantasy of survival and adaptation in an alien landscape without an instruction book, Rainworld is also very keen on minimizing the bells and whistles and gimmicks that could otherwise intrude on this fantasy. Mechanics that are nearly omnipresent in 2D platformers and broader gaming as a whole get stripped down as much as possible, leading to an initially jarring but later on a more authentic, immersive, and therefore more emotionally resonant experience. There is no moment when you're spending time looking through a menu or interactive interface, the gameplay is an uninterrupted flow. For example, inventories that are usually unreasonably spacious get restricted to slugcat's 2 hands and stomach, or looking at the map requires slugcat to stand still, shut their eyes and recollect it from memory. Additionally, shopkeepers that usually seem to pop up regardless of the level or region you are in are swapped for scavengers, deranged denizens of the wasteland who will trade a limited variety of goods to you in exchange for pearls, a type of currency that you also have to physically carry around with you, just like everything else. Special items that empower your stats or give new abilities only exist in very small quantities, and all of them are temporary or come at the cost of occupying your tiny slugcat hands. The game renounces the idea that progression should come from incremental gear upgrades and an exponentially growing power fantasy. Instead, progression in Rainworld comes from memory and discovery. The other, more tangible aspect of the game that sours its reputation is its steep difficulty, which will inevitably feel unfair at certain points. The wiggly and indefinite movement of slugcat combined with the quick, one-hit nature of the creatures of the land forces you to exercise caution and generally not look for combative situations. Similarly to the Mesozoic mammals of old, your strength is your small size, being able to use tunnels and pathways to traverse the landscape out of sight, and your intelligence, which you can use to trick and evade your hunters. That's not to say that you can't fight your way through the game, it's just that you shouldn't expect any mundane encounters. 2D platformers have taught us that any enemy we face is reasonably beatable, and that when we defeat or destroy them, we get something in exchange, whether it's currency, experience, items, or at the very least, bonus score. This, such as it is, doesn't really exist in rainworld. When I first explored the outskirts, I went to great lengths to kill a green lizard to see if I would get any extra abilities or some advanced items in exchange to make my journey easier. But when I did, I realized that there was no such thing. It's safe to say that I was somewhat let down by this, but when my disappointment faded, it dawned on me that the enjoyment of the encounter came from the challenge and the depth of the combat itself, not from the prizes that were promised to me as a consequence of it. I guess it's the conditioning of constant reward streams found in some other games that made me go for it. I wanted to have the experience of the unquestionable protagonist. When I ventured further upwards and one of the music tracks called Urban Jungle started to slither into the scene, only then I realized that this game was going to be something entirely different. Rainworld isn't a game about bending your environment to your will. It's about surviving as a part of the ecosystem of a stark, untamed land, and it achieves this fantasy perfectly through the discussed unique takes on presentation and gameplay. You are not supposed to be a hero, and you are not meant to be in control. You are merely a tiny, lonesome slugcat in a vast unknown world of fear and death.